Greetings, class, and as we continue Unit 2, move into Chapter 3 of the Western Heritage, continue to talk about Greek culture and a lot about Greek philosophy and kind of the spread of Greek worldview, Greek philosophy, Greek culture, Greek tradition across the Western world. There's a lot of exciting things in this chapter and some things that we want to talk about that go beyond the textbook. So again, I trust you've read the textbook well, but our goal for the next few minutes is to highlight and discuss some of the things that are either really important in the text that we don't want to miss, or that are not mentioned in the text at all. There's a preview of what we'll be talking about. First of all, we're going to talk about the Greek philosophers themselves, right? We can't get into all of them, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We'll talk about the spread of Hellenism. So we're going to talk about the Greeks and their impact on the rest of the Western world. Well, it's going to be really important to understand how that all started and why their ideas permeated the rest of the West, if you will. And we're going to talk about Alexander the Great, who was a part of that spreading of Hellenism, and his legacy, right, from a biblical standpoint, which our textbook, understandably, isn't going to discuss. Finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about engaging Greek philosophy. It's one thing to understand what the ancient Greeks used to believe, and it's another to know how we would engage and respond. And the reality is, I would argue that Greek philosophy is alive and well in the West, and so learning to engage ancient Greek philosophers is actually going to be helpful for learning to engage our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers. So without further ado, let's talk about some early 5th century classical Greek philosophy. So again, for context, just remember that the Greeks have won the Persian Wars. The question is, are they the good guys, the bad guys? In the last chapter, chapter 1, transitioned on the birth of civilization. At the very end, our authors said that philosophy and science, as we understand them, could only develop once the Greeks had discarded supernatural explanations and reliance on divine intervention as a way of understanding the world. In other words, they were looking for more scientific or natural explanations for all reality. One example of this would be the Greek historian Thucydides, who tried to explain the Persian Wars not so much from the perspective of the pantheon of Greek gods, but he tried to come up with natural historical explanations for why events occurred. As philosophy was developing, right, in the 5th century, one of the famous ones, as mentioned in your textbook, was the philosopher Critias. And he said gods were nothing but inventions designed to deter people from doing what they want. So again, he's going to take God or gods out of the picture entirely and going to say we only invented religion so we could control people. It reminds us of what Karl Marx, and later V.I. Lenin said, that religion is just the opium of the masses. It's just used to control people. Right, and then Protagoras, and this is mentioned in your textbook, History of the Eyes of Faith, but also in this 5th century BC, famous for having said that man, ultimately not God, is the measure of all things. And that's going to be one of the questions we're going to continue to ask, is in Western culture, are we living in a society where we aren't measuring things based on God's standard, but on man's standards? So the philosophers themselves, right, the first philosopher we've got to discuss just in brief, not in much detail, is Socrates. Believed in the truth. He sought it. He believed, through careful reasoning, thought that there was a divine being out there. So he didn't doubt that there was a God. He just could never figure out who the true God was. It's kind of sad, really. He was known as the interrogator. So he would continue to ask why, because he determined that most people couldn't actually give a good defense for why they held to whatever beliefs and worldviews they actually had. So it's a good practice. Some people found it a little annoying, right? He said people have few beliefs they could rationally support. Right? He overall had some contempt for Greek democracy. Right? The city-states were growing and becoming more powerful. He was skeptical because he believed a political system that he said empowered the ignorant to make decisions about things they did not understand wasn't really a great scenario. And I think that's actually pretty relevant as we think today. Right? There's plenty of people out there who vote and have a say in politics, but aren't necessarily very well informed. Maybe they're misinformed. But at the same time, the question is, would you get rid of democracy and deny someone the vote just because they're not educated? So some of these moral dilemmas and ethical ones are not new, right? He died drinking hemlock, right? Interestingly, he submitted to it because that's what the Poles wanted him to do. Kind of an annoyance during times of war. And he submitted to the polis even though he questioned its authority. Then, right, his pupil, Plato, right, founded the academy, and then the idea here is, right, it's a school where you go to learn to be good citizens. So not so unlike going to maybe public schools today. You get private tutors, and then, right, there's a belief in, he believed more strongly than Socrates did in the polis, in the city-state. He believed philosophers were the only ones, though, who could redeem and guide the polis. So he said, right, you can't really trust the people to make good, informed, and wise decisions for themselves, but philosophers, those who sit around and think and are educated and wise, they're the ones who can ultimately direct the polis, the direction. The last philosopher we'll talk about for the time being is Aristotle, right? Who believed that the most important function of the polis was moral. So the city-state wasn't so much about economics and wealth. It wasn't so much about even protecting society. He said the goal of having people live together was to form a moral society. Right? He believed moderation and balance was the key to successful polis. So he felt having a strong middle class, right? So you don't have discontented poor or power-hungry wealthy, but a strong middle class to balance things out. Right, and for our intents and purposes, he's important because he's the teacher and mentor of Alexander the Great, who we'll talk about shortly. So the spread of Greek ideas, Greek philosophy, Greek culture and worldview, or what we call the spread of Hellenism, really starts when Philip, in the 4th century BC, when Philip of Macedon, right, it was right region on the Balkans, conquers all of Greece. And it's interesting, right, not to go in a lot of detail, but Philip was trained, right, and tutored under the general Epaminondas, a Theban general that is the only known general to defeat the Spartans in land, and actually took control of the Peloponnesus for a short time. So he was a very highly trained warrior, and through a series of battles, his son Alexander gets involved, managed to conquer or unite the Greek city-states. In fact, the city of Philippi today, where Paul writes his letter to the Philippians, is named after Philip of Macedon, right? And it's interesting, right? By conquering all the city-states and uniting Greece, it actually is the end of the Greek city-states themselves, because now they're just cities within a larger state. They're not independent and autonomous city-states. So you could actually make an interesting argument that he ends democracy in some ways by conquering Greece. But Philip announced a new Persian war, right? What a better way to unite your troops and get all of Greece excited. But he's assassinated on the eve of the campaign, and whether that was because of his wife, whether his son Alexander was a part of it, some of his generals, hard to say. A lot of debate out there by scholars. But he nonetheless is assassinated, and his son Alexander, right, starts his campaign. And I would love to spend long stretches lecturing on him and his campaigns and the details of it, but for our intents and purposes, for the time being, right, he took a relatively small army of about 30,000 into Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, right? And some of the famous battles in which he defeated the Persians were at the Battle of the Granicus River, the Battle of Issus, and eventually Gaugamela. And there was a number of other significant battles, and he was a brilliant fighter and strategist. He fought at the head of his army, right, and his troops definitely respected him. And he had a lot of success, and he managed to defeat what was then a crumbling Persian Empire. Right, so it conquers all of them, and it's interesting, right? That was what was prophesied in the book of Daniel, and we'll look at that shortly in chapter 8, in which Daniel is told, right, that this ram is going to destroy the goat, and then immediately that ram is going to, be killed. And out of its horns will come up 4 other horns, right, 4 other rulers after him. And the interpretation is that this is the Greeks that do this. So well before Alexander ever begins his campaigns, God had revealed to Daniel and the Persians, the Babylonians and Persians, that Alexander was going to come. In fact, one of the stories goes that when Alexander was moving through the land between, or the land of Israel at the time, that one of the Jewish priests actually showed Alexander the prophecy in Daniel 8, and it's one of the reasons potentially that Alexander opted to spare Jerusalem, to spare Israel, rather than defeat it like he had up to the north with Tyre and Sidon, and he did down in Egypt and everywhere else. He wanted to spread the Greek way of life, or Hellenism, everywhere he went, and we're going to make a case that he probably was pretty successful at doing just that. Right? But he dies of a fever in 323 BC after conquering basically the known world at the time, and he's only 32 years old. And we're going to talk about the significance of that in just a minute. Right? And when he died, he famously said something along the lines to his generals, "To the victor goes the spoils." So basically he had no long-term plan for what was going to happen next. He just said, fight it out, and whoever gets whatever territory, it's all yours. So that leads us to his successor, so the Diadochi, and one of his generals, Ptolemy, took Egypt, Seleucus took Mesopotamia and Syria, Antigonus took Asia Minor and Macedon. There's some debate over there because the Bible mentions four generals, right, that are going to rise up and rule, and there's some debate over whether Lysimachus or Cassander, who both kind of fought and took parts of Greece, are the ones that the prophecy was referring to. Right? Just a sense of the size of the territory that Alexander conquered, right? Massive, moving all the way towards the modern day India. His accomplishments. So on the one hand, he's very accomplished as a general, right? Conquered and ruled the known world in about 3 years' time. For the time he starts his campaign and crosses over into Asia Minor to the end, only about 3 years goes by. And he was effective at spreading Greek culture. He built libraries. The most famous one was in Alexandria, Egypt. Spread the Greek language, which is really important, and we'll talk about that at the end here, and Greek culture as a whole. And it's significant that he did, like we said, fulfill the prophecies in Daniel 8 and in Daniel chapter 8. At the same time, right, Alexander, called the Great, referred to as the Great, studied by historians and just amateurs alike, right? There's always the interest in who Alexander actually was. Had a number of significant flaws. Some have said he was pretty selfish, right? An opportunist, that really he just had an army and he liked to kill people and he loved war. And so calling him great when he is the one who, remember, when you conquer people, you kill a lot of people. One of his friends, actually, who'd fought a lot of battles with him, he got in a drunken rage, got upset, and actually had his friend executed because of it. Came to regret it later. He didn't have a long-term plan, no governmental organization, so he basically kind of left Greece to itself, left his generals after himself. So he didn't really plan for the future. This is not necessarily someone you want to emulate. Again, in that he's very short-sighted, right? He was living for this current world. And then the morality, right, as was common in Greek and eventually Roman culture back then. Not only was he a polygamist, probably believing himself to be God and then worshiping multiple gods and then having multiple wives, but also a homosexual, as best people can tell that he lived an immoral lifestyle. So, some great accomplishments in some senses, but also some major character and moral flaws. So evaluating, how should we as Christians view the life and accomplishments of Alexander the Great? Here's just a couple of suggestions and some feedback as you're thinking and processing. Right, first of all, it's interesting that Daniel, when he hears the prophecy about Alexander the Great, he doesn't say, wow, that is so cool, I can't wait to see what happens. He says, I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. In other words, he knew that there would be a lot of bloodshed and suffering because of the campaign of Alexander the Great, and it made him sick to his stomach. Right, Psalm 39:48 says, Lord, make me to know my end, that I may know how frail I am. Deliver me from my transgressions. Alexander, right, who seemingly conquered the known world and yet dies rather quickly. And again, there's conspiracy about whether he was poisoned or just died from some disease that he caught in India. But he would have done well to recognize his own human frailty. 2 Kings 8:10-12 is another interesting example, kind of like the one in Daniel. It's where the man of God Elisha, while he's on the one hand anointing a future king, is weeping because he says, I know the evil that you will do to the children of Israel. And I think we need to bear that in mind as we look at great conquerors of the past who live fascinating lives and have great strategies and win huge battles, and yet at the same time it's easy to make it not personal and to forget that a lot of people lose their lives and suffer in the process. named Roisman, speaking on Alexander, said, "But on the personal level, the story of Alexander the Great appears to us an almost embarrassingly perfect illustration of the man who conquered the world only to lose his soul. After fighting, scheming, and murdering in pursuit of absolute power, he found himself at last on a lonely pinnacle over an abyss with no use for his power and security unattainable." Right? And that's, if you compare him to the person of Jesus, in about 3 years, he's going to conquers death, conquers the known world. But he does it in love and with a long-lasting plan. And, comparison, I'll take Jesus. Thank you very much, Jesus the Great. So what's more important, right? Who Alexander was or who he is now? Tough. As far as philosophy goes, to changing gears, what are some of these ideas, again, more specifically, that were being spread? We know that they're fairly naturalistic and in some ways ignore the gods, but you had a group known as the Cynics, right? These are the skeptics, right? So if you're cynical or skeptic, they're the disciples of Socrates, always asking questions, and another wild guy named Diogenes who denied most of life, lived in a barrel, and tried to basically say that we needed no material possessions whatsoever, right? They would argue that nothing can be known, really. So just kind of live conventionally, don't rock the boat too much, right? And at the same time, it didn't provide the Greeks with a lot of dignity, a sense of meaning. So if there's no such thing as material possessions, there's not really much point to life. We're skeptical of everything. Well, what's the point of being alive? Right? The Epicureans was another group. They argued to the contrary, right? We don't have to fear death. We don't know there's nothing that happens, right? When we die, we're 6 feet under. So live life to the fullest, and this is where we get, right, the modern, modern, it's an old term, but the Christian hedonism, right? So live life to be happy. Whatever makes you happy, that's the way to go. And that's all well and good, but it's not realistic for everybody. So if you're poor and you're a slave and someone says live life to the fullest, but you can't, really, is that going to be a satisfying life? And then you get the Stoics, right? And it's who they are is kind of in the name. They're Stoic. They live lives that are free of apathy, apatheia, so freedom from passion. Again, don't rock the boat. Don't do anything too crazy. Now, the Stoics argued, right, that there was some sort of divine logos, some divine word, some spiritual being or something that kind of connected all of humanity and material society together. And it's interesting, when John writes to the Greeks in his gospel, he writes, "In the beginning was the Logos," right? And the word, the Logos, was God. And he's relating, and he's trying to identify with potentially a Greek audience who would be familiar with this idea. And he's saying Jesus is that divine Logos. He is the God who connects and makes sense of all things. So one of the big questions we have to ask ourselves, right, is how do we engage? And you're going to get an opportunity to do that in your discussion post. How would you engage with a Cynic or Epicurean or a Stoic? But we get an example, right, of Paul engaging with the Athenians in Acts 17, right? He's waiting around for some friends. And so there's a few lessons. We're not going to read the passage. I'd encourage you to check it out for yourself. But in 16 to 32, it talks about his famous, right, interactions on Mars Hill, where it's famously said that the people would come and just basically talk about the latest ideas, right? It's just the place to think. It's the philosopher's dream. And a few things we can draw from the text as you look at it, right, is go where the people are, right? That Paul doesn't wait around, right, in his apartment. He gets out into the streets and he looks around and he looks for opportunities, just like Jesus did long ago in his ministry. He recognized his audience, right? He says, so he recognized that there were certain Stoics, Epicureans, probably some Cynics there. He says, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Well, that's great. So he goes out and he engages. He knows how they think and what they value and what's important to them. And then make observations, right? Use the culture. So verses 22 and 23, he says, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. And that's encouraging, right? And he's acknowledging them. For as I walked around and looked carefully, right? So he's making careful observation at your works, objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So he takes one of their own stories, one of their own gods, one of their own traditions, and finds a way to make a connection to the living God. Right? He goes on and encourage them, speak in familiar terms, right? Because we've talked about in last week a little bit, that all truth is God's truth. There are those who would argue that the Bible is it, the Bible is all you need, and just give people the Bible. And I'm totally believe in the sufficiency of the Bible, but recognize that Paul sets an example of knowing where his listeners are coming from, and he actually goes on to quote some of their own philosophers. Says, "For in him we live and move and have our being. Some of your own poets have said we are his offspring." Now, that's referring to a poem in which Zeus is the chief god. But Paul is he says, look, there is a God. There's one primary God. To you, he's an unknown God. I want to declare him to you. And we are, right, his offspring. We all come from him, right? This is quoting Epimenides, and then Aratus, who was a Stoic philosopher. Right, Epimenides in Cretica, or talking about Crete, he actually said, "They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, and idle bellies." And I love the King James actually translates that slow bellies. But he says, "But you are not dead, you live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being." Right? And so you see the quote, and then the "we are his offspring" is from Aratus's Phenomena. "Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus, even the sea and the harbors are full of deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring." So again, you see he takes two quotes. He knew their philosophers. He knew what they thought and they believed. And he said, let me tell you what's true. Those things are true, but they're true of the one true God and of his Son, Jesus Christ. Right? And then when it comes down to it, he related to them. He made observations. But ultimately, he didn't just say, hey, let's be friends and talk about philosophy for the sake of philosophy. He got to the end of this message, at the end of the conversation, and he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He commands all everywhere to repent, he says to the people. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And it's at that point that some of them went wild and said, this guy's a fool. Why we don't? This is ridiculous. But others were curious. And it's interesting, right? Paul doesn't say, all right, I've got to make sure that I'm politically correct. I've got to make sure that the gospel is not offensive. He knows that the gospel is an offensive message. But he doesn't offend them. He relates to them. He interacts with them in a very respectful way, and yet he lets the message of the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit do its work. So the next point of encouragement is when we get out, when we go where the people are, and when we relate to them and we speak the truth boldly, we can trust God with the increase. Right? He says, when they'd heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. But others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. And at that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. And so we are called, like Paul, to engage with our culture, engage with our friends and our coworkers, to answer their questions. And ultimately, we want to take them to the point of who is Jesus, right? That Jesus is the answer to their questions. Jesus is the answer to their purpose in life, and the answer to how they can know what happens after this one. But we ultimately, thankfully, trust God with the increase. So in wrapping up, right, are you ready, like Paul was, to give an answer for the hope that's in you? Are you ready to engage some Greek worldview and philosophy? Because you're going to have your opportunities to do that if you're willing to get out of your homes and your dorms. So summarizing, right, the Greeks, we talked about their philosophy, we talked about the spread of Hellenism everywhere, and what you're going to end up with is, in some ways, right, Hellenism that's going to permeate the Greek culture. See, after the fall of Alexander the Great, the Greek, his four generals, kind of fight with one another until a new power comes on the scene, the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire conquers all the territory that Alexander the Great had, but they kept a lot of the same cultural traditions. In fact, they took the Greek gods and they renamed them. They took the Greek pantheon. They kept the same language, right? A lot of the Romans actually used and spread Greek. They realized that it was easy. Why change things all over the empire? It's easier for organization. And what was nicely set up, right, is we get this huge, massive Roman Empire that was prepared for when Jesus would come. And that's John, the first couple of verses of John chapter 1 in Greek. Right? It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so the Western world, the Roman world, which we're going to talk about next week, was permeated by Greek culture, which is going to prepare the way for just the right time, Galatians 4, chapter 4 says, for Jesus to step into eternity so we could understand. So look forward to talking with you next week more about the Romans. In the meantime, have a great weekend. God bless.